I am doing well myself. Just feel like I need to reintroduce myself to you because I have trimmed my beard up a little bit since I was here last time. I'm wearing contacts, and I say that because my grandkids didn't recognize me. I showed up at the house on Friday, and they're like, "Who's this weird guy in our house?" And my grandson, who's 5, actually leaned over to his dad, like, "He looks different." And so it took them about a day to warm up to me. Now we're good. But anyway, I'm Aaron. I'm one of the pastors here, and I'm really excited to be here for this series in particular, 21 Days of Prayer. And I say that because one of our key visions for Spout Springs is that we fully believe that we're all on this journey to become the person that God has created us to be. And that's for you, that's for me. And so a lot of the decisions, the majority of our decisions that we make, they're run through that vision. Does it apply to this vision? Does this vision help? And 21 Days of Prayer in particular is part of that. How can we help you? How can we help equip you to become the person that God has created you to be? And so hopefully that's helpful. And I'm going to start off by kind of recapping something that Steve talked about last week, and I know you've heard it here before, this 3-2-1. Because again, it's so important for us to understand this idea because it's so helpful. It's helpful for me because it's challenging for me too. So it's 3 daily times with God. So out of the 7-day week, we're encouraging you at least 3 of those spend time with God. We're encouraging during 21 Days of Prayer to spend 7 days a week with God. But in a routine practice, we know life gets in the way sometimes. And I'm not saying that to make an excuse. I'm just saying the reality. As a pastor, as somebody in vocational ministry, I sometimes struggle with that. Life happens. Things get in the way. I get distracted, right? And so that's a really helpful piece. 2 worship services a month. I don't know if you're aware of this. I think Steve's mentioned it before, but today in the American church, the person that considers themselves a churchgoer, a Christian, the average person attends church 1.7, 1.8 times a month. That's just kind of where we're at, especially since COVID. And so we just encourage you, at least 2 times a month, try to make it into a gathering. We'd love for you to be here more than that, but at least 2 times a month, do that. And then lastly, get in a connection group. You know, Barry just talked about that. We have a push to get as many people to encourage you because, and I can share this with you from my own heart, other than accepting Christ and being baptized, one of the things that has propelled my growth the most has been being in a small group, a connection group, a group of people that are like-minded, that are there to encourage me, that are there to pray for me. When things are going good and when things are going bad, it's really important to know that you have some people around you that understand and are in it with you. And so I would just encourage you, if you've never done that before, maybe you've tried it, maybe it didn't work, I would encourage, give it a try. Give it a try this year, this season. Go on, fill out the survey, and jump in a connection group. And really, as we talk about the 21 Days of Prayer, we'll kind of recap again what Barry said, because I already had this in my message to talk about, and then he talked about it, so I'm going to talk about it too. The booklet. You know, we're a couple of weeks into 21 Days of Prayer, and so maybe this is your first weekend here. Maybe you've been traveling. Who knows, whatever reason. Maybe you haven't started yet. Maybe you did start week 1, and that booklet, whether you got the physical booklet or you downloaded it electronically, has kind of been sitting collecting dust, and because you got distracted because life's happened. Here's what we don't want you to panic and feel like you have to go back and play catch up. Okay? We just encourage you, dive in where you're at. Dive in, finish out strong this week as you can jump into week 3, really starting tomorrow. So, we're going to continue this series in 21 Days of Prayer and really talking about the Lord's Prayer. And in that, in the heart of the Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, lies this profound prayer that we call the Lord's Prayer. And I'm going to stop right there for a moment because some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because some of you grew up in some faith traditions where you recited the Lord's Prayer every single Sunday that you showed up at church. You recited that Lord's Prayer together. Like you know it, right? You know it. And for some of you, this might be brand new. This might be something you've heard of, you're like, I don't know, I don't really know much about it. Some of you, again, like this might be brand new to you, this idea of the Lord's Prayer. And among its verses, we're going to be looking at Matthew 6:11. This particular verse holds a timeless message about dependence and trust in God's daily provision. So, I say that, and to preface it this way, Steve gave me 6 words to speak on this week. So Steve helps divide up kind of our teaching calendar and who's going to be speaking. And so as I was getting ready to know that this was on the calendar, he said, hey, how about you speak on this? I have 6 words. It's really going to be more than that, but he gave me 6 words from the Lord's Prayer to specifically speak on today. So we might get out a little early. I don't know. We'll see what happens. But here's the 6 words. Matthew 6:11. Give us today our daily bread. So it's a couple of lines in. I know some of you, again, if you recited it your whole life growing up, your childhood, whatever it was, and you were attending a different denomination of church, a different faith tradition, you're like, wait a minute, you skipped the beginning. That's okay. Steve did that last week. He's going to be finishing up next week. We're going to start right here, because when I read that, some of you in your mind, you're automatically going on to the next line, the next line, the next line. And that's great. And so, but before I really dive into this, before I dive into these 6 words, I just want to kind of unpack kind of a broader perspective on the Lord's Prayer. In this Lord's Prayer, in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is talking to his disciples and sharing this model of prayer, because that's what this is. This is a model. This isn't you have to pray this way all the time, and this is the only way you can pray. That's not what this is. This is a model. This is a template for a way we can pray. And I think that's helpful if we do pray through the Lord's Prayer on occasion. You know, whatever that means for you. Some of you, it still might be every day because that's near and dear to you, and that's what you grew up with, and that's what you're familiar with. For me, I didn't grow up with it. And I'll explain that a little bit more here in just a moment. But in this, there's so much more to it than just this model of prayer. There's this emphasis that Jesus is painting for his disciples about this relationship, this direct relationship that they can have with God. And each line of the prayer has some very specific, deep significance about how we should approach God. And so, as I said, as I look at these 6 words and I began thinking about this message, I wanted to go back to me, like, when do I remember these words? When does the first memory I have of hearing the Lord's Prayer? Or for me, it was actually a prayer where somebody prayed this as part of a prayer we were having at a meal. And it was my grandmother's house, my dad's mom, and I was very fortunate because pretty much as far back as I can remember, until 1st grade, I actually lived across the street from my grandparents, out in a rural farm community in North Texas, and I could walk across the street to my grandparents whenever I wanted and spent a lot of time with them. And I still, to this day, my grandmother is the foundation of my faith. I mean, Jesus Christ is the foundation, but she's the one who got me started. She was the model. She's still the model that I seek after. You know, here she is, all of 4'10", you know, but she's my giant that I look to, the giant of faith that I look to. And she was a mother of 9. My dad was next to the youngest of 9. He had 5 older brothers and 3 sisters, 2 of them older, 1 younger. And so when we got together as a family, it was crazy, but it was fun because there was a lot of us. And we're talking brothers and sisters and cousins, a lot of us. And my dad being next to the youngest of 9, some of his older brothers and sisters had gotten married and were having kids about the same time that my dad was born. So my dad grew up with nephews and nieces that were around the same age as him. So my dad grew up with my cousins. Like, he did life with my cousins. And so I grew up doing life with my second cousins. Some of those cousins of mine had kids. I went to high school with them. Like, literally, we were like a grade or 2 apart. And so I spent a lot of time. And so I just remember very fondly being in my grandmother's house, surrounded by all these people. Because if we were there for a holiday, if we were there for a family reunion, with that many kids and grandkids for her, and some of them were great-grandkids for her, I mean, there was 50 plus of us most of the time when we were there. Sometimes it was closer to 100 would be in her house. And I just remember very specifically them praying, and sometimes very specifically praying about God's provision for food and this daily bread. And you know, it didn't hit me till I was older. It didn't hit me till I was probably teenage-ish, later in my teenage years, a young adult, that it really hit me, because I think back to those days, and I remember, you know, we just had so much food. You know how it is when you have a potluck. Like, you always end up having a ton of food left over, right? And I remember my grandmother collecting everything and, you know, putting it in leftover butter dishes, you know, butter containers, and there's stacks of them in her fridge. And I often wonder, like, why is she saving everything? And it didn't hit me until later that my grandmother was a young mom around the Depression era, and a farm on a farm in North Texas. And there were literally times she didn't know how she was going to feed her kids the next day. And there was this dependence on God. And I think about most of us today have never dealt truly with food scarcity. Most of us today don't. And that's just a statement of fact, right? We don't struggle with that. There might be some of you that at some point in your life you have. But for the average American today, we don't, because we have pantries in our houses that are full. And a lot of us have refrigerators that are full of food all the time. And then when it comes time to eat, we go out to eat. And the food's still in the pantry, and it's still in the refrigerator, right? And then you come home with more leftovers. So we don't always struggle the same way that other people have. And that just wasn't my grandmother. I think back, as Jesus is talking about this to the disciples, this was part of their era too in early biblical times. There were times they didn't know where their next meal was going to come from. But I want to unpack this a little bit more, because there's still, even with that, there's so much more to this concept of daily bread. You know, when we talk about the concept of daily bread, and what does that mean? What does that look like when we pray that concept of daily bread? First, bread symbolizes all our daily necessities. It's not just about food, okay? It's not just about food. It's about everything in our day. And so it's not just our physical, but also our emotional, our mental, and our spiritual nourishment. And I think there's times that I have, because of the way I grew up, because of what I experienced growing up, saying the Lord's Prayer and praying for my daily bread, if I'm only thinking about food, there's a part of me that sometimes goes, it's okay, God, I've got, like, my pantry's full, it's okay. I mean, thanks, the pantry's full, but it's full, right? And so there's part of this that I need to understand, we need to understand, that it's not just about the food. It's about our daily existence. It's about every aspect of our life. And in this prayer, we're invited to trust God in all aspects of our life. That's what he's asking of us, is to trust him with everything, with our existence in every circumstance, good, bad. And as I was thinking through this, and my personal challenge to sometimes stay focused on this and pray about this when in sincerity, because that's the problem, is sometimes, not knocking anybody, but here's the reality. If this is something you just recite every single time you're in service, there's a lot of times, like, it just becomes routine. It's just something we do, and it really has no meaning behind it. And I can get that way even in my own prayer life, not even just doing the Lord's Prayer, but even in my own prayer life, I find moments, there are seasons where I struggle, and it just becomes just like this routine thing that I do. And I started kind of digging in my own soul of, what is that? And so I want to share with you a couple of the difficulties that I face in that, and I think this will resonate with you as well, and that will help us kind of as we look at this a little deeper and figure out how can we do this better. I think one of the first things is that I struggle with is because there's so many times in my head that I think the things that I want to pray for, or I think I want to pray for, when I step back and look at them, I think they're insignificant. And when I do that, I think they're insignificant to God. And I don't think that Not that he doesn't care, but he doesn't care about that. Like, he doesn't care about the little details. And that's just kind of the thinking that we sometimes have. And man, I've experienced so many other times in my life that he's shown up in such mighty ways, even in the little details of my life. And so, and I think part of that is we struggle with that. Again, this is me. I'm not putting this on you, but it might connect with you as well. I think there's times that I struggle with it because, I pray generically. Like we tend to, I fall into these generic prayers. And I think I don't want to pray specifically sometimes because I'm afraid that God's not going to answer. And then what does that do to my faith? That guy, I have this inner fear that he's not going to answer, and then I'm going to begin questioning, is he really there? But then there's also this side of me that I think I don't pray specifically sometimes because I'm afraid he is going to answer. And if he does, what does that mean? And what does that require me to do? Like, what does that do to my... So, some of you may know of a guy named Francis Chan. And he's a pastor, author, really kind of blew up in the late 90s, early 2000s. His first book that blew off the shelves was a book called Crazy Love. And I read that book, and it was super challenging to Christians, and in that he talks a lot about what a lukewarm Christian looks like in the first couple of chapters. And I think it was by chapter 3 or 4 I began questioning, am I really a Christian? Because it was that challenging. But it was good, it was deep, it made me really think. Well, back in 2011, I had been in ministry, had a bad experience at a church, left ministry, was working in the college system, had just got a dream job in the college system that I had been applying for a while. I got accepted for a position as the Director of Veterans and Disability Services at one of the largest community colleges in the country and the largest for hearing impaired students. And so here I am, moved into this job, this role. I had 100 interpreters alone that worked for me, American Sign Language, that were in with students all day long in classes interpreting for them. And here it is, I'm like, okay, God, I got this. This is great. In the meantime, I'm feeling like I'm supposed to be back in ministry. I knew that's what God had called me to, challenged. I'm in this situation. Supposed to be this dream job. I'm just going to tell you it was miserable, okay? And so in the midst of that, I find out that Francis Chan is coming to Phoenix to speak at the largest Baptist church in Phoenix, North Phoenix Baptist Church, to the young adult group. People post-high school, so college/early in their career. So 18 to 25-ish is probably their kind of target demographic for their young adults. I was not in that demographic in 2011. I was 44. But they didn't publicly put out that he was coming because they knew a lot of people would go. He was all over the place speaking at all these conferences. I didn't even know how. I found out he was going to be there. I drugged my wife down there. We went to go see him. And I quickly realized as we walked in this room with hundreds of other people that 90% of the people in the room were younger than us. Quite significantly, like 20 years younger than us. And so I'm looking around going, wow, okay. But anyway, I'm sitting here, I'm listening to Francis Chan. And one of the things that he starts talking about is this idea of a shut-up prayer. I'm like, and this is what he says. He says, you need to be praying so specifically that when God answers that prayer, you can't help but go, shut up, that did not just happen. And I can tell you since that moment in that room with him, hearing him say that, I have had several shut-up prayer moments in my life. And what's crazy, I still have a tendency to drift back and start praying generically, but yet I've seen God show up over and over and over when I pray specifically. And so that's the challenge. How do I continue to pray specifically? So, you're not the first because there was another service before you. But I'm going to share this with you because there's something that I had a shut-up prayer moment this week. And some of you know, if you've been doing 21 days of prayer, last Tuesday, as part of your book, it was a list of prayers for the staff. And I had listed something in there. Somewhat specific, somewhat generic. I didn't put specific details in. I didn't even know the specific details at the time when I wrote it. When they asked me, like, hey, submit some prayers for us to put in the book. Okay. And that prayer, since I'm a retired military, a lot of you know that, was specifically for me to have some patience in dealing with TRICARE. You know, the medical system where you try and get care. That's what we call it on the West Coast. That's why they call it TRICARE. And with the VA, with some disability stuff that I've been wrestling with the VA with for a couple of years. And so I put that out into Heather as well as some other stuff. And I totally forgot about that, in all honesty. Thursday, I'm out hiking. Before I fly out here, I'm hiking Thursday, and I start having this conversation with God. And I'm like, okay, God. And it's all around my VA thing. I have a specific thing that I was rated for. I'm rated at 0 now because I had surgery in 2022. My symptoms are actually worse now than it was before the surgery. The VA has been fighting me, and I'm just like, this is ridiculous. Some of you who've dealt with the VA know exactly what I'm talking about. Some of you will know what I'm talking about in a couple of years. Anyway, so I had put in a claim for them to relook at this. And that's the generic part. You didn't know that detail. I just said with the VA. I had put in a claim back in November, finally submitted all the evidence February 1st. So just 18 days ago. Some of you know how fast the VA normally moves. Well, as I'm walking Thursday, I had just looked at my VA thing, and it said that they were in decision or in notification. So it went from evidence collecting, decisions been made, now it's in the notification phase. So they don't tell me what the notification is yet, and I'm just like, and sometimes that can take several weeks for that to pop up and for you to see what that looks like. So I'm like, okay, so I'm walking that Thursday, and this is with my sinuses, and so I'm rated at 0, working with this individual, and they're like, I'm pretty sure we can get you to 30% based on your current symptoms, and I'm just like, okay, so that's what I'm kind of like, okay, 30%. I don't know why, I'm walking with God. I'm walking, and I said, you know what, God? You can do anything. You can do anything. And I'm praying right now that I get a favorable decision soon. And you know what? I'm going to pray that it's 50%. Not even kidding you. So I went home, told my wife about it. She's like, okay. Which is typical of her going, okay, yeah, all right. I flew from Phoenix to Dallas on Friday to fly out here, and I'm sitting in the terminal in Dallas waiting to catch a connecting flight to come to Raleigh. I open up my VA website. It says you have a decision notification. Okay. I open up the letter, and I'm not even joking. I was literally expecting to get 0. What I was really expecting in my heart, that the VA was going to go, yeah, you're still 0. I had a 50% on that. Now here's why that's really, for me, is really, really cool, and why I think the 21 days of prayer is so awesome. By Friday morning, I forgot that you guys had us in your prayer list on Tuesday, right? Like, because we get busy with life. I honestly had forgot that. And I started thinking through and thinking, because I don't know that it was just me. I don't think it was just me. I think this collectiveness of us, there's this power when we pray together. And I want to thank you for those of you that are participating in 21 Days of Prayer, and those of that maybe prayed for me specifically on Tuesday, or whenever you got to that day of the week, maybe you were behind. Like, if you voiced, thank you. Because God has shown up in a miraculous way, and it's just an amazing reminder for me that God cares. And I want to say this as we get into this a little bit deeper. I'm not here to tell you like this is an easy journey, right? Being a Christian is not easy. There's still moments that are difficult. But here's the thing. When we begin praying, by praying for our daily bread, it's going to pop up here on the screen. By praying for our daily bread, when we do that, we cultivate an attitude of gratitude, recognizing God's continual provision in our lives. And so that's what it was for me Thursday, because Thursday when I'm walking and I'm talking with God, it wasn't about food, but it was about my life. It was about everything else going on in my life, and how much everything else that's going on impacts my life, right? Some of the medical stuff I'm dealing with, how it impacts my life. I'm like, God, help me in this. Help me get help in this. And so there's something really powerful in that. And just again, this reminder for me that even in times of uncertainty, and I would say especially in times of uncertainty, that God is there. Whether I feel it in the moment or not, God is there. And I want to spend the rest of the time that we have together talking about a story from Exodus 16, which is really a great example of what this looks like. And there are many stories that we could have used from the Bible to talk about this, but I want to use Exodus 16. And some of you will be very familiar with this story. Before I actually start reading, I'll kind of set the background for you because we're going to kind of jump into the middle of the story. Many of you have heard the story of Moses and set my people free, where he's going to go. He goes to Pharaoh and they have all these Hebrew slaves, and he says, set my people free. And they take off across Egypt. They cross through the Red Sea on dry ground. The waters come back down, wash Pharaoh's army away, and they go on into the wilderness. They're headed to this promise that God's promised them, this promised land, right? And that's what I'm really trying to point out to us, and I want us to really hear clearly. Is so many times the journey's difficult, but the promise is worth it. And sometimes we get caught in the middle of the journey and the difficulty of the journey, and we want to give up and we want to fight back. And so as we unpack Exodus 16, I want to look at kind of this threefold purpose that we see in the story about praying for our daily bread, praying for our daily existence, praying for God to show up in all aspects of our life. And the first purpose is this practical purpose. There's a literal situation here in this story, and some of you may have been there in your life, where there's this literal purpose where they don't know where they're going to get their next meal. There's thousands of them. Here they are. They're not in a town. They're out in the wilderness. And the Israelites start groaning and complaining. They're hangry, right? And they start complaining to Moses and Aaron, Moses' brother, and they're complaining, and they even go back to the point of going, why didn't we just stay in Egypt and die? At least there we were sitting around the campfire. We were warm. We had pots full of meat. I don't know about you, but I've been that way in my own life with this journey where, like, okay, God, I know what you promised, but right now is really, really hard. I just want to go back to where I was because I knew that, and it was comfortable, and it was easy because I knew where I was. And so there's this practical purpose of literally feeding the people, and I want you to hear what is said here in Exodus 16, 6 through 8. It says, so Moses and Aaron said to all the people of Israel, by evening you will realize it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. So I'm going to pause right there a minute. So again, they're grumbling like, we shouldn't go back. Like, why did you bring us here? That's what they're saying to Moses and Aaron. And Moses and Aaron start to go, wait a minute. By morning, by evening, and then in the next morning, you're going to realize that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. This wasn't us. This is God. And it says, in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord because he has heard your complaints, which are against him, not against us. What have we done that you should complain about us? Then Moses added, the Lord will give you meat to eat in the evening and bread to satisfy you in the morning, for he has heard all your complaints against him. What have we done? Yes, your complaints are against the Lord, not against us. I love how many times Moses tells them, hey, it's not against us. It's against God. Like, you need to be, like, here's one of the things that I find really encouraging from that is even when the Israelites are frustrated and they're complaining, God hears them. And God responds to them. God takes care of them and still meets their needs, even when they're responding to him through complaining. I'm not telling you should complain to God all the time. I'm not saying that's the magic key. What I'm saying is it's okay to be frustrated. It's okay to raise your fist. Like, God, I don't understand. Where are you in this? I need you to show up. I need you to do something. Because we see this play out in their life. And for me, that's encouraging to me. You know, when God is working through our lives, again, when we're pursuing this promise that he's given us, in this instance, it was a promise to the Israelites that they're going to go from captivity to freedom in the promised land. But the journey's hard. The journey's difficult. There's going to be days that they want to give up. There's going to be days that you want to give up. But it's about getting to the place to receive what he's promised. It's about what we get and experience on the journey. The second purpose that we see is this eternal purpose. There's this eternal purpose. And this eternal purpose glorifies God and reveals his power. And for me, that's what's happened in some of those shut up prayer moments in my life when I can go, shut up, that did not just happen. And that's I've started several phone calls like that with my wife where she knows I've been praying for a specific thing. I'm like, shut up. I just had a shut up prayer moment. She knows exactly what I mean. And she's like, what happened? Like, what did God do? You know? And in Exodus 16, 9 through 12, listen to what it says here. It says, Then Moses said to Aaron, announce this to the entire community of Israel. Present yourselves before the Lord, for he has heard your complaining. Remember, I mentioned that a while ago. Like, they're complaining. He doesn't even say he's heard your prayer. It says he's heard your complaining. God is listening to us. And as Aaron spoke to the whole community of Israel, they looked out toward the wilderness. There they could see the awesome glory of the Lord in the cloud. Then the Lord said to Moses, I have heard the Israelites' complaints. Now tell them, in the evening you will have meat to eat, and in the morning you will have all the bread you want. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. And so again, that's just this amazing reminder for me personally that when I lean in and I really rely on God, when I pray to him, when I reach out to him for my daily existence, all aspects of my life, physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, that he's faithful to show up. And he sustains us each and every day. Sometimes even in our complaining, right? And then there's this third purpose, this spiritual purpose. This one we don't always like as much. This is a testing and training people to trust God. You know, sometimes we say we trust God, but it's through our actions that we really demonstrate what we trust. And so sometimes God does test us very specifically in this passage. Didn't read the verses, but back in verses 4 and 5 of Exodus 16, when God first talks to Moses about providing the manna and the quail, he even says in there's a line in it that says like, and I'm going to test them. I'm going to test them and see what they do. Because I want you to hear what he says. In Exodus 16, 20 through 21, it says, Then Moses told them. So this is Moses talking to the Israelites. It's like, hey, listen to this. This is what God says. He says, do not keep any of it till morning, but some of them didn't listen and kept some of it until morning. But by then it was full of maggots and had a terrible smell. Moses was very angry with them. So I don't know how many of you have found yourself in this situation, but here's the situation that the Israelites are in. They complain. God shows up, demonstrates his glory, demonstrates his power by providing manna, falls from the sky. Bread falls from the sky, essentially. That's what we equate it to. And he said, only pick up enough for that day. The first 6 days of the week, the first 5 days of the week, you're going to pick up just enough for that day. On the day 6, you're going to pick up enough for the next day because that's the Sabbath. And I don't want you picking it up on the Sabbath. But the rest of the days, the first time, just pick it up. Just pick up just enough that you need for you and your family. And you know what they did? Some of them picked up more because we have a scarcity mentality. God can show up with some blessing in our life and we're like, no, I like more, because I'm not sure you're going to show up tomorrow, God. I know you showed up today, but I'm not sure what you're going to do tomorrow. And that's his testing of us, or our faith, and that's what I've experienced in my own life, is when I trust him, when he shows up in those moments and answers my prayers so specifically, and I trust him, it should give me more confidence to trust him the next day, and the next day, and the next day. But in all honesty, it doesn't always do that, because life gets in the way. My thoughts get in the way. You know, I start trying to rationalize, and I go back to that. God doesn't care about that. God doesn't. No, he does. He really cares. And this is what also I really love about this testing that God does. Trusting God doesn't mean sitting and waiting. You don't say this prayer of, God, take care of my needs today, and then you plop down on the couch and you wait for DoorDash to come and ring your bell and show up with food, right? I love this one commentator that I read, this biblical commentator I read all the time, David Guzik. This is what he says about this passage. He said, they still had to go out and get it. God didn't drop it in their mouths. He's talking about the manna, right? Like, God provided it, but he didn't drop it in their mouths. They had to get up off the ground and go gather it up. and trust Him in that. And so in this moment, like when we do that, like there's this response, there's this interaction with God, there's this obedience that we see that's required. Back to my Francis Chan conference that I went to, that I snuck in, young adults. So I get the shut up prayer moment. Again, here I am. I had been in ministry at a church, left. I'm doing education stuff. I actually felt like maybe God led me there because now I'm dealing with all these veterans. I'm like, you know, I'm a pastor. I can deal with these veterans. I get to talk to them every day. Like I said, it was a miserable existence, okay? Worst job I ever had, highest paying job I ever had, worst job I ever had. And I'm like, this is miserable. It was also 42 miles from my house across Phoenix. So I'm commuting every day, an hour to an hour and a half by myself because I can't use the HOV lane because it's just me. And so I'm driving and I have a lot of conversations with God. Some of them, I was complaining. I remember very distinctly going, God, why? Why did you give me this job? Why did you make this happen if I'm going to be so miserable? If this is such, why? Closest thing I ever heard to an audible voice of God, I've heard it so deep in my spirit, and this is what He said, because I had to get your attention. I was working at a church as a volunteer, a high-level volunteer. Some of you have been there. I was helping to lead our student ministry. I was leading our men's ministry. I was helping lead our small group ministry, just as a volunteer. And there was a lot of times I was like, well, God, I'm doing a lot of good things. I'm praying that I'll be in full-time ministry because that's what I really feel like I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to be in full-time vocational ministry, and I'm praying for it, but then I'm kind of sitting on the couch waiting for somebody to come ring my bell and go, hey, we need a pastor. Why don't you come on down to our church? Right? That didn't happen. And so as I'm sitting in this Francis Chan conference, and I'm sitting there with my wife, and some of you have experienced this before, maybe it's been Steve or Barry or whoever, some pastor you're listening to, you're hearing them speak a message, and as they start talking, they're talking so specifically about something you've been thinking or something you said to somebody else, you start going, does somebody have my house bugged? Like, is Steve eavesdropping on my house? How does he know what's going on in my life? In this moment where Francis Chan is there talking to young adults, 18 to 25-year-olds, in the middle of his talk, he stops, looks the direction that my wife and I are sitting, and goes, some of you in here, you're in your 40s. That narrowed it down pretty good. Some of you are in here in your 40s, and you're waiting for God to do something. And I want you to know that God's waiting for you to show that you're serious. And so it's one of those moments, my wife elbows me, and she goes, he's talking to you. Right? You know, like usually you feel it for yourself. In this moment, it was so powerful. My wife was like, he's talking to you. I'm like, okay. And so I just start wrestling with that thought. Like, what does this mean? What does this mean, God? What do I need to do? So we sit there, we finish out our time there. My wife and I are walking to the parking lot, walking to our car. She looks at me, and she goes, you're quitting your job, aren't you? And I said, yes, I am. This was at September of 2011. I put in my resignation, keep driving back and forth to work for a couple of weeks. In the midst of that, I got introduced to a pastor, started talking to him. This is one of those, I felt like God told me, you need to go talk to this guy. So I went and sat down in his office. I said, hey, I don't know what your deal is. I don't know what's going on here. I just want you to know that I'm an ordained pastor looking to be in full-time ministry. I know you know a number of pastors here in the Southwest Valley of Phoenix. If you know anybody that's looking for somebody, I don't need a full-time salary. I'm retired. I just really want to make a difference. And so he's like, well, what do you do? What's your background? So we just start having a conversation like, we need to go to dinner. Like your wife and my wife and us, like, let's go to dinner. So we started this conversation. So I meet with him a couple more times, and he says, early October, he says, hey, if we get our building paid off, they had done a renovation on their building. He said, we're trying to get that loan paid off. He goes, if we get that paid off, I think we could bring you on in January to start as a part-time basis and see how it fits. I'm like, okay. So I'm driving back and forth to the other side of town in Phoenix, and I'm praying, and I just remember having that very specific prayer with God where I'm going in the tunnel on the I-10 in Phoenix, and I'm about to go in this tunnel. That's how powerful it was. I remember exactly where I was at when I said this prayer. And I was like, God, if the only thing that's keeping me from being on staff at this church, for me being back in full-time ministry is money, I know that's not an issue for you. And you'll take care of it. And I'm just praying right now that you will take care of that issue. I didn't know what was going to happen. Literally the next week, the next Thursday, I'm having breakfast with this pastor, and he says, "You're never going to believe what happened." He hadn't heard about my prayer yet. He said, "You're never going to believe what happened." He goes, "Tuesday afternoon, somebody came into our office and gave us a check that almost completely paid it. Like there was just like $1,000 left on the loan. They gave them a check to pay off the whole rest of the loan." And I said, "Oh my goodness." And I told him about my drive and about my prayer. And he goes, "Well, apparently God listens to you more than he listens to me, because I've been praying for a long time that this loan would be paid off." Now, I'm not saying I have some special connection, okay? But I'm just saying, like, there's something about these powerful moments, these shut-up prayer moments. And so what ends up happening is I end up leaving that job. January 1st of 2012, I went back into full-time ministry, and I've been back in full-time ministry since, and I stayed at that church for 11 and a half years. And it was because of some faithfulness and reliance on God and trusting God and stepping out even when it was difficult. So, again, that's just a really powerful moment for me. But what's crazy in all that, so I'm sitting here sharing some of my shut-up prayer moments with you. Let me just be honest with you. I still struggle with prayer some days. I'm challenged sometimes of what to pray for. I still does God really care? Does he really want to hear this? And so many times, I need to go back and remember, because in the midst of today, I so many times forget, just like the Israelites. Here they are. They get marched out of Egypt. They get marched through it. Like God shows up time after time after time after time in this Exodus story of saving them. And the very next day, they're like, "God, where are you at? You should have left us there. Should have let us die." And then God shows up again. And then they complain about something else. And then God shows up again. I do the same thing. So I just say that to let you know that's part of our humanness. It's a challenge. It's not always easy. But we got to keep going. And so I kind of want to end with this question and just a couple of statements. Are you trusting God daily? Because that's what this really comes down to. This is what this really comes down to. Are you trusting God daily? Every single day, are you relying on him to take care of you physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually? Are you relying on him to do that? Or how much have you started relying on yourself or relying on other people to meet those needs for you? I want to go back and just review these 6 words again. Give us today our daily bread. Give us today our daily bread. My hope for you today is that as you leave this place over the next couple of weeks, the next couple of months, the next couple of years, you'll never look at these 6 words the same again. That when you do, you will understand that there's so much more. There's so much more that God wants to do in and through you than to just take care of your physical needs, food, sustenance for the day. He cares about every aspect of your life. And are you trusting him with that? So just a couple of notes I wrote down, and I wrote it down because I wanted to say it a very specific way, just as God kind of put it on my heart. First, this passage gently nudges us to recognize our ongoing reliance on God's provision. Because when it really comes down to it, there are things that we can't control. There are aspects of our health we can't control. There are aspects of our finances we can't control. As much as we want to be in control, we don't. Right? And so there comes a point where we've got to recognize that we've got this ongoing reliance on God. And then this, lastly, as we speak these words in prayer, the next time you pray these words, let us embrace them with hearts filled with trust and gratitude, assured that our Heavenly Father looks after our every need, whether you feel it or not. And then ultimately, may we draw comfort from his provision and navigate each day with unwavering faith and contentment. Because, man, that's a powerful word. For me, that's the key in my life, is contentment. Living in his abundant grace, of just knowing that there's this promise that he's made me. And I might not be living in it today. I'm on the journey to get there. But man, the promise is worth it. The promise is worth the journey, just like the Israelites discovered. I don't know where you personally are at today. I don't know where you came in spiritually. Maybe you're brand new to church. Maybe you've dabbled in church at some point when you were younger, and maybe just through the course of today, over the last couple of weeks, or maybe even the last couple of months, because sometimes like this is a process for people to get to a point where they say, hey, you know what? I'm interested in discovering what it means to have a relationship with Jesus Christ. There's a really easy way to do that here at Spout Springs. That's simply grab one of these blue bags that are located around the room. We have some people that are trained to come, sit down with you. It takes about 8 to 10 minutes, help you unpack this bag and show you what it looks like to have a relationship with Jesus Christ, to be able to know this promise, this journey that God's promised you. But again, it's not easy. But man, there's a peace and a comfort that comes in knowing that He's in it with me. I'm not in this alone. And I would even like rephrase that. He's not in it with me. I'm in it with Him. Like, because this is about Him. I'm in this journey with Him. And then for some of you today, maybe there's just this physical response that you need to make. And maybe that's by sharing in communion. As we talk about the bread and just the power of that in this prayer, but really the significance of communion as we talk about His body being the bread that was shed and His blood that was shed for us on the cross. Like there's this relationship that we're invited to because of what Jesus did on the cross. Wherever you're at, wherever you find yourself, whatever you find yourself, the tuggings of your heart, here's what I would challenge you with today. However God's asked you to respond, be faithful in that. Be faithful in that. Because remember, He doesn't drop it in your mouth. He doesn't just show up and drop it in your mouth. There's a response to what God's asking, what He's giving you, what He's challenging with. There's a response from us. If you would join me now as we pray. Father, we just thank You so much for today and these amazing reminders, just that Your book, Your word, is so filled with reminders for us. Things that happened thousands of years ago are so relevant to us. We can learn so much from these people. And today, as we unpack Exodus 16 and talk about what that looked like for the Israelite people, Your chosen people, and their deliverance from slavery, from physical slavery. And Father, Your promise to us for deliverance from slavery to sin through Your Son, Jesus Christ. We thank You for that today. Father, my prayer is that each person in here, that their relationship with You would grow deeper in the coming days, weeks, and months. Father, we lift this to You now in Your Son's name. Amen.